You have 10 seconds to leave this floor before security drags you out. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. They ordered the maintenance worker off the executive floor, told him he had 10 seconds before security removed him in front of investors and board members. He didn't argue. He smiled and made one call. What happened next would freeze the entire skyscraper, because power doesn't always sit in the corner office. Beneath the polished marble and tailored suits, something far more fragile was cracking. Rowena Virali didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence behind her carried more weight than shouting ever could. Investors stood near the glass walls overlooking the skyline. Champagne paused halfway to their lips. Assistants pretended not to stare. Security shifted closer. The man in the Navy maintenance uniform didn't look rattled. Caleb Ward checked the time on his old wristwatch as if she'd merely reminded him of an appointment. His boots were still dusted with drywall powder from the service corridor. A tool bag rested at his feet. Nothing about him suggested he belonged anywhere near the executive boardroom, yet he didn't move. The air on the 42nd floor felt thinner than it had minutes ago. Rowena's gaze sharpened. Did you not hear me? He had heard her, every syllable. He'd also heard something else, the faint irregular pulse beneath the building's digital hum. It wasn't audible to anyone else, just a subtle lag in the display screen cycling through investor projections behind the glass. He tilted his head slightly, studying the reflection in the polished wall. Numbers flickered for half a second too long. Most people wouldn't notice that. Caleb did. Security stepped forward. The executive floor gleamed with controlled wealth, custom Italian marble, sculpted lighting, the scent of expensive citrus polish. Beyond the frosted glass, the boardroom tables stretched like a runway for power. And in that space meant for decision-makers, he stood where no one believed he belonged. 10 seconds. Rowena folded her arms, confident in the choreography of authority. This was her building, her event, her moment. The maintenance worker reached into his pocket. A few executives smirked, assuming defiance or desperation. Instead, he pulled out a phone with a cracked corner. He didn't raise his voice. Hold that thought. He dialed. Rowena's jaw tightened. Escort him out, but before security could touch him, one of the digital screens inside the boardroom blinked. Then another. A soft ripple of confusion moved through the investors as projected revenue charts stalled mid-transition. It was subtle, almost invisible. Caleb lowered the phone from his ear but didn't hang up. 3 seconds, Rowena warned. Across the glass wall, a financial dashboard glitched again, this time long enough for the chief legal officer, Marissa Holt, to frown. She stepped closer to the screen. Is that a delay? She murmured. No one answered her. Caleb's gaze never left the numbers. He'd seen that pattern before. 5 seconds. Rowena's composure didn't crack, but irritation sharpened her tone. You're done here. He finally looked at her directly. Calm, steady, almost sympathetic. Ma'am, he said quietly, if I leave right now, you're about to lose more than this meeting. A few investors exchanged looks. The audacity of it. Rowena stepped closer, heels clicking against stone. That's not your concern. The screens flickered again, this time longer. Behind the glass, an assistant rushed toward the central console. Another executive tapped at a tablet, confusion spreading like a shadow across his face. Caleb glanced at his phone. The call had connected. Yeah, he said softly into it, eyes still on the glitching projections. It's happening again. Same signature. Rowena heard only fragments, enough to irritate her further. You think theatrics will save you? He ended the call. The hum in the walls deepened, barely perceptible. A tremor beneath the surface of perfection. Marissa's voice cut through the quiet. Rowena, our investor access portals just froze. A ripple of murmurs broke the room's polished stillness. Security hesitated. Caleb didn't smile this time. He simply watched the numbers stall completely. And for the first time since issuing the ultimatum, the CEO's confidence faltered, just slightly, as the 42nd floor began to realize something was wrong. The investor dashboards didn't just freeze, they rolled backward. Projected gains blinked out, replaced by error strings and cascading authentication failures. A sharp electronic tone pulsed from the main display, soft at first, then multiplying across screens like an echo in steel. Marissa stepped fully into the boardroom now, heels striking fast against marble. "We're locked out of the live investment portal," she said, no longer whispering. "It's rejecting executive credentials." Rowena straightened. "That's impossible." Another assistant spoke from the console. "It's not just here. Remote shareholders are reporting session terminations." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Caleb shifted his weight, eyes scanning the reflection of scrolling code in the glass wall. He didn't look surprised. He looked certain. Security still stood beside him, unsure whether to grab him or wait. Rowena turned back toward him slowly. "What did you do?" He exhaled through his nose. "I didn't do anything." "That's the problem." The electronic hum thickened, punctuated now by the faint vibration of overworked servers somewhere below their feet. Marissa studied him carefully. "You said again?" "What did you mean?" He hesitated, then answered evenly. "There's a breach pattern in your legacy architecture. It masks itself as latency before it spreads to authentication nodes." Several executives stared blankly. Rowena did not. Her irritation shifted into something sharper. Calculation. "Your maintenance," she said. "You wouldn't even have access to that level of infrastructure, I don't," he replied calmly. "But I built the layer underneath it." The words landed heavier than they sounded. A silence pressed in. An investor near the glass muttered, "Built?" The screens flickered violently, this time replacing financial charts with a blinking warning about compromised encryption certificates. Somewhere in the building, an alarm chirped once, then died. Marissa's eyes widened. "Rowena, if this propagates to client accounts—" "It won't," Caleb interrupted, voice steady but firmer now. "Not yet." Rowena faced him fully. "Explain." He glanced toward the boardroom table, where champagne flutes stood untouched. "Your current cybersecurity team patched surface vulnerabilities last quarter, but they never closed the original back door embedded in the authentication cascade. It's hidden in a cost-reduced update from 3 years ago." Her jaw tightened. "We invested heavily in that system." "I know," he said quietly. Another pulse rippled through the monitors. The service elevator behind them dinged, doors sliding open to reveal 2 frantic IT analysts rushing out with tablets in hand. One of them froze when he saw Caleb. Recognition flickered across his face. "Sir," the analyst started, then caught himself, confused by the uniform. "Rowena, the breach signature matches an archived protocol labeled CW17. Caleb didn't react outwardly, but Marissa did. "CW?" she repeated. The analyst nodded quickly. "It's tagged as the original security framework revision. We thought it was decommissioned." "It wasn't," Caleb said. Rowena's gaze sharpened like glass under pressure. "CW stands for what?" He met her eyes without hesitation. Caleb Ward. A low murmur spread across the executive floor. The IT analyst swallowed. He designed the first-generation encryption matrix before the public launch. Several heads turned sharply toward him now, not at the uniform, but at the man inside it. If you're still here watching this unfold, subscribe with the bell on, because stories like this prove the underestimated are often the architects behind the curtain. Rowena's expression hardened, but doubt crept beneath it. "You left this company nearly a decade ago." "My daughter got sick," he said simply. I stepped down. The words weren't defensive, just factual. Behind the glass, another alarm sounded, longer this time. Marissa stepped closer to him. "Can you stop it?" Caleb's eyes returned to the screens. Code scrolled faster now, probing deeper layers. "Yes, but not from here." Rowena hesitated only a fraction of a second. That fraction was visible to everyone. "Where?" she demanded. "The primary server vault," he replied, "level B2. The physical node still houses the root partition. If we isolate it before the exploit replicates, we contain the damage." The analyst nodded rapidly. That's correct." Rowena looked from the analyst to Caleb, pride and urgency warring in her posture. Moments ago, she'd given him 10 seconds to leave. Now the building's stability balanced on whether he stayed. Another monitor went dark. Marissa's voice cut in quietly but firmly. "Rowena, investors are starting to notice." Through the glass wall, uneasy conversations were growing louder. Phones were being raised, questions forming, public, visible, uncontainable. Caleb picked up his tool bag, not as a laborer dismissed, but as a man walking toward something he understood better than anyone else in the room. Rowena stepped aside. Security didn't touch him, and as he moved toward the elevator, the hum of the skyscraper deepened, like a machine recognizing its original maker had just returned. The service doors slid open with a metallic sigh. He stepped inside, tool bag in hand, Marissa close behind him. After a half-second of hesitation that didn't go unnoticed, Rowena followed too. The doors sealed them off from the executive floor's polished panic. The elevator descended. Fluorescent light hummed overhead. The scent of marble polish gave way to metal and dust as the digital display ticked downward, 41, 38, 32. Rowena folded her arms. "If this is some elaborate performance, it isn't," he said evenly. She watched him instead of the numbers now. The maintenance uniform, the worn boots, the calm breathing. None of it fit the archived personnel file forming in her memory. "You designed the original encryption matrix," she said, more a statement than a question. He nodded once. "And you never disclosed this vulnerability?" "I did," he replied. "In the exit audit. It was flagged as a long-term risk if the root partition was ever outsourced." Marissa's brows knit together. "We outsourced infrastructure optimization 3 years ago. The elevator dropped past level 12. Rowena's jaw tightened. That decision increased margins by 12%. It also created a bypass, he said quietly. "Whoever's exploiting this knows your internal architecture intimately. They're not attacking from outside. They're navigating through something familiar." A faint vibration traveled through the elevator cables, subtle but there. Marissa looked at the ceiling as if she could see through steel and concrete. "Is the vault already compromised?" "Not yet," he answered. "They're mapping. Once they mirror the authentication cascade, it spreads. The elevator dinged at level B1 but didn't stop. It continued downward." Rowena studied him in the harsh light. "You expect me to believe you can outmaneuver a coordinated cyber attack because you wrote the first draft of our system?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," he said. "I expect you to decide whether you want this contained before your investors watch their portfolios evaporate in real time." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Silence pressed into the tight space. The doors opened at level B2. Cool air rolled in, heavy with ozone and machine heat. The corridor beyond was narrower than the executive halls above, lined with exposed piping and reinforced concrete. Security panels blinked red along the walls. This was the labor zone. The place meant for technicians, not CEOs. Yet Rowena stepped out first. 2 engineers were already there, arguing over a tablet. They froze when they saw him emerge behind her. One whispered, "It's him." The other nodded once, stunned. Caleb moved past them without ceremony. His hand brushed the cold metal of the primary vault door, fingers lingering for half a breath as if reacquainting himself with something old. The panel beside the vault blinked an error code. He leaned closer. "That's new," he murmured. Rowena crossed her arms again, though the gesture lacked earlier certainty. "Explain." "They've inserted a recursive loop into the authentication handshake," he said. "It forces the system to validate itself indefinitely while copying credentials." Marissa looked at the engineers. "Can you shut it down?" One shook his head. "We can't access root-level commands. It's locked behind legacy clearance." All eyes turned toward him. The air inside the corridor felt charged, thick with heat from the server banks behind reinforced walls. A low mechanical roar vibrated underfoot, constant and alive. Rowena's voice dropped. "Do you still have clearance?" "No," he said. "But I have something better." He set his tool bag down and unzipped it. Inside were standard maintenance instruments, wrenches, insulated gloves, a small diagnostic tablet far older than the sleek devices the engineers carried. He pulled out the tablet. The engineers exchanged doubtful glances. "That device isn't even on our current network," one said. "It doesn't need to be," he replied. He connected a cable directly to a secondary maintenance port beneath the security panel, a port most executives probably didn't know existed. The small screen flickered to life, lines of code scrolling in stark white against black. Rowena stepped closer despite herself. "You kept access?" she asked. "I kept knowledge," he corrected. The engineers leaned in, watching as he navigated through command strings with muscle memory precision. He didn't rush, each keystroke deliberate. Marissa exhaled slowly. "If this fails, it won't," he said, though his voice carried the weight of risk. Above them, the building shuddered faintly. An alert echoed through the corridor, this one louder than before. One engineer glanced at his tablet. "They've started replicating user credentials." Rowena's composure cracked at last. "How long?" "Minutes," the engineer answered. Caleb's jaw tightened. Sweat beaded lightly at his temple, not from fear but from the heat radiating through reinforced steel. He adjusted the cable and typed another command. The old tablet paused. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the recursive loop on the main panel froze mid-sequence. The engineers stared. "It's stalled," one whispered. Rowena didn't smile. She didn't relax. But for the first time since the screens flickered upstairs, she looked at him not as an intruder, but as the only person in the room who understood the battlefield they were standing on. The stalled code on the vault panel flickered like a heartbeat caught between beats. For one suspended second, the recursive loop held in place, frozen mid-command. Then a new line of script attempted to overwrite it, faster, sharper, more aggressive. "They're adapting," one of the engineers breathed. Heat pressed harder against the corridor walls. The mechanical roar behind the reinforced door deepened, servers pushing against thermal limits as authentication requests multiplied above them. Caleb didn't look up. His fingers moved again, rerouting the stalled sequence into a containment buffer. "They didn't expect resistance at this layer," he said quietly. "This was supposed to be invisible." Rowena stood just behind his shoulder now, close enough to see the reflection of code in his eyes. "Can you block it completely?" "Not block," he replied. "Redirect." Marissa crossed her arms tightly. "Redirect to where?" "A sandbox partition," he answered. "A dead environment. Let it think it's expanding while it suffocates itself." The engineers exchanged a quick glance. One of them nodded slowly. "That partition hasn't been active since the initial architecture phase." "Exactly," he said. The old diagnostic tablet hummed in his hands, its battery indicator already dropping under the strain. He adjusted a setting, bypassing a layer that hadn't been documented in any modern manual. Rowena caught it. "That path isn't listed in current system maps. It wouldn't be," he replied. "I buried it." Her gaze sharpened. "Why?" "In case someone powerful decided short-term optics mattered more than long-term security." The words weren't accusatory. They didn't need to be. A tremor ran through the floor, subtle, but unmistakable. One engineer checked his tablet again. "Credential replication is accelerating. It's copying executive-level access." Maurice's voice dropped lower. "If that reaches investor accounts—" "It won't," he said again, though this time there was strain beneath the steadiness. The main panel flashed red, then white. Above them, faint through layers of steel and concrete, a chorus of notifications began echoing from upper floors. Phones buzzing, alerts firing. Investors noticing something wasn't right. Public. Visible. The very thing Rowena had feared most. She stepped back half a pace, absorbing the implications. "If this leaks outside this building, it already has," Marissa said quietly. "Social feeds are asking why our stock preview stream paused." The CEO inhaled slowly, fighting the instinct to regain control through force of will. Authority didn't function against invisible code. Caleb adjusted the cable connection. Sweat rolled down his temple, disappearing into his collar. His breathing remained measured. The sandbox partition blinked into partial existence on the tablet's screen. "Almost," he murmured. The engineers leaned closer. The attack script hesitated again, confused by the rerouting. For a moment it appeared to retreat. Then a new burst of commands slammed into the authentication cascade. "They've escalated," one engineer whispered. "This isn't random. Someone knows the original framework." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew that too. Only a handful of people had ever seen the blueprint of that system in its infancy. Only a few understood how its foundation intertwined with corporate identity layers. He typed a final string of commands and pressed enter. Nothing happened. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. Then the recursive loop shattered into fragmented code, redirected into the dormant sandbox partition. On the main panel, the red warning softened to amber. The engineers stared in disbelief. "It's isolated," one said, voice unsteady, replications contained. Above them, the faint chorus of notifications diminished. Rowena closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the reprieve. But Caleb didn't relax. "They're still inside," he said. Marissa blinked. "What?" "The breach isn't just the loop. That was the distraction." He straightened slowly, eyes scanning fresh lines of data forming beneath the surface. This was reconnaissance. The engineer's relief faded instantly. Rowena stepped closer again. Meaning whoever launched this knows the system intimately enough to test its boundaries without collapsing it. His voice remained calm, but something colder threaded through it now. They were measuring response time. Mapping who intervened. Marissa's expression shifted. "Mapping you," he didn't answer. The sandbox partition stabilized, holding the malicious code in suspended isolation. But on the tablet's lower corner, another anomaly blinked faintly, small enough that no one else noticed. Except him. A secondary ping. Originating not from outside the firewall, but from within the corporate network. Caleb felt the weight of it settle in his chest. This wasn't an external predator. It was internal. Rowena saw the change in his posture. "What is it?" He looked at her finally, steady and direct. "The breach didn't come from outside," he said. "It started here." Silence fell heavier than before. The mechanical roar behind the vault door seemed louder now, almost accusatory. One engineer shook his head. "That's impossible. Internal access requires biometric clearance." "Yes," Caleb said softly. "It does." Rowena's composure stiffened again. Not with arrogance this time, but with dawning realization. Someone inside Virali Dynamics had either opened the door or left it unlocked. And as the isolated code pulsed harmlessly in its sandbox cage, the real threat shifted from invisible hackers to something far more dangerous. Betrayal within the walls they thought they controlled. The word didn't need to be spoken aloud. It hung there anyway, thick as the heat rolled off the server vault. Rowena's heels clicked once against concrete as she stepped back, mind recalibrating at executive speed. Internal access requires level 7 biometric clearance, she said. There are fewer than a dozen people with that authorization. Marissa's eyes moved between them, including you. And you, Rowena replied sharply. The engineers shifted uncomfortably. Caleb kept his focus on the small anomaly blinking at the corner of his tablet. A faint pulse, almost shy. If he hadn't written the original monitoring code himself, he might have missed it entirely. It's not active access, he said quietly. It's a mirrored credential. One engineer frowned. Clone copied, he corrected. Somebody duplicated executive-level identity tokens and planted them internally. The breach loop was just to test whether we'd notice. Rowena's jaw tightened. Who would risk that? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rerouted the sandbox partition into deeper isolation, sealing the captured malicious code behind a secondary wall. The corridor lights flickered. Above them, faint vibrations suggested renewed activity, executives scrambling to stabilize optics while pretending nothing serious had occurred. Marissa checked her phone. Investor Relations is fielding calls. Word spreading that something glitched. Rowena inhaled slowly. We tell them it was a routine systems recalibration. That buys minutes, Marissa said. Not credibility. If this breach went public before containment was complete, stock projections would crater. Trust would fracture. Headlines would multiply before sunset. Public exposure. Not the kind Rowena wanted. Caleb unplugged the diagnostic cable and stood, stretching tension from his shoulders. The old tablet's screen dimmed, but didn't power down. They mirrored credentials through an abandoned maintenance node, he said. The same one your infrastructure vendor flagged as low priority during cost optimization. Rowena's eyes narrowed. That was reviewed. On paper, he replied. The engineer nearest him swallowed. We signed off on that after executive approval. Silence again. The hum of servers filled it. Rowena looked at Caleb differently now, not as a subordinate, not even as an equal, but as someone holding information she didn't yet control. Can you trace it? She asked. Yes, he said. How long? Long enough that your investors upstairs will start asking why their preview dashboard stalled. Marissa exhaled sharply. We can't let them speculate. Rowena turned toward the elevator decision-forming. We take this upstairs. If this is internal, it gets addressed publicly before rumors distort it. The engineers stiffened. Publicly? Caleb watched her carefully. There it was, the pivot point. You humiliated me in front of them, he said calmly. If we handle this quietly, they'll never understand how close this company came to collapsing. Rowena met his gaze. You want acknowledgement. I want accountability, he replied. The corridor felt smaller now, like the building itself was listening. Marissa stepped in, voice measured. Rowena, if this is internal misconduct and we conceal it, liability multiplies. Transparency might actually stabilize confidence. The CEO's pride wrestled visibly with reality. Above them, another notification alert echoed faintly. Caleb picked up his tool bag. If we move now, he said, I can trace the mirrored credentials from the executive console. But it has to happen where everyone can see it. The implication landed hard. Board members, investors, senior staff, witnesses. If you've ever seen someone underestimated until the truth forced its way into the light, subscribe now, because this is where quiet strength turns visible. Rowena studied him for a long moment. The maintenance uniform, the worn gloves, the steady breathing. Minutes ago, she'd given him 10 seconds to leave. Now she needed him to lead. "Fine," she said at last. "We go upstairs." The elevator doors slid open with a metallic clang. As they stepped inside, the air felt heavier than before, not with panic, but with anticipation. Rowena didn't speak during the ascent. Marissa watched the digital floor count climb. Caleb stood still, eyes distant, not calculating code now, but consequences. Because if the trace revealed what he suspected, this wouldn't just be a cybersecurity issue. It would be exposure. Of decisions made for profit. Of warnings ignored. Of vulnerabilities buried to protect quarterly reports. The elevator dinged at the executive floor. The doors opened to a wave of anxious voices and glowing screens. Investors clustered near the glass walls, murmuring. Board members stood near the central console, tension visible in every rigid posture. The moment the group stepped out, conversation stalled. All eyes turned toward them. Rowena walked forward first, reclaiming space. But she didn't step ahead of him this time. She stopped beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, voice amplified through the room's integrated sound system, "we experienced a contained security irregularity." Murmurs rose. Caleb moved toward the executive console. He could feel their eyes on his back. The man they'd watched nearly be escorted out was now approaching the system at the heart of their investments. He set down his tool bag carefully. The mirrored credential ping pulsed faintly again on his tablet. Rowena's voice carried across the marble and glass. "This issue will be addressed transparently." Her gaze shifted to him briefly. A silent acknowledgement. He connected his device to the central console. The massive display screens overhead blinked, replacing frozen financial projections with live system diagnostics. Public, visible, irrefutable. Caleb's fingers hovered over the keys. "Let's see who opened the door," he said quietly. And then he began the trace. The executive floor fell into a silence so complete that even the soft whir of the ceiling vents sounded amplified. Hundreds of eyes tracked the cascading lines of code as they appeared across the massive display screens, projected larger than life above the boardroom table. Caleb stood at the central console, shoulders squared, maintenance uniform stark against polished marble and tailored suits. His reflection shimmered faintly in the black gloss of the monitor, layered over streams of encrypted identifiers. Rowena stood to his right, not in front, not behind, beside. "Walk us through it," Marissa said, her voice steady but edged with urgency. He nodded once. The mirrored credential was injected through a dormant maintenance node, he began. It piggybacked on a legitimate executive token, copied the biometric hash, then masked itself as routine internal traffic. An investor near the glass swallowed audibly. In plain English, it means someone with high-level clearance either authorized it or had their access duplicated without noticing. A ripple of discomfort moved through the executives. Caleb typed another command. The traceline branched into a web of internal timestamps and access points. He followed it methodically, isolating anomalies. On the upper corner of the display, a name field flickered, blurred by encryption. Rowena leaned closer. "Can you decrypt that?" "Yes," he said. "But once I do, there's no walking it back." Marissa didn't hesitate. "Do it." The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Caleb entered a final string of commands. The system resisted for half a breath, then unlocked. The blurred identifier resolved into a clean, unmistakable executive credential. Gasps scattered through the room. The name glowed large across the screen. Elliot Kessler, Chief Infrastructure Strategist. He stood near the back of the executive cluster, face draining of color. "That's not possible," Elliot said immediately, voice tight. "My credentials never left my device." Caleb didn't look at him yet. "Your credentials didn't have to leave. The exploit copied your biometric hash during the vendor migration update 3 years ago." Rowena's head snapped toward Elliot. "You supervised that transition. It was board approved." Elliot shot back. "We reduced operational costs by 8% and opened a maintenance node with legacy override access," Caleb said calmly. Murmurs grew louder. Elliot shook his head. "This is ridiculous. Even if a vulnerability existed, no one could weaponize it without direct system knowledge." Caleb finally turned to face him. "You're right." The words landed softly. "But someone with enough architectural understanding could." A heavy silence followed. Marissa stepped forward. "Are you implying internal sabotage?" "I'm stating," Caleb replied evenly, "that this breach was a reconnaissance test. It mapped response times, escalation paths, and who intervened." Rowena's gaze shifted between the two men. "You're saying this wasn't about stealing funds," she said slowly. "It was about measuring weaknesses, yes. And now that it's exposed publicly," Marissa added, "whoever initiated it knows we're aware." The massive screens behind them displayed the full trace path, time-stamped and undeniable. Every investor in the room could see it. Public exposure. Exactly as he'd insisted. Elliot's composure cracked further. "This is circumstantial. You're projecting authority because you wrote some old code." Caleb didn't flinch. "I wrote the foundation," he corrected quietly, "and foundations remember who alters them." A faint tremor of approval moved through the room, not applause, but recognition. Rowena inhaled deeply. The weight of optics pressed down on her. Investors were watching. Board members were calculating risk. "Elliot," she said carefully, "did you authorize any undocumented vendor adjustments?" He hesitated. "Just long enough." Marissa noticed. "That hesitation," she said sharply, "isn't helping you." Elliot's voice rose defensively. "I followed strategic directives. We were under pressure to show growth. Everyone agreed the risk was minimal." "Minimal," Caleb repeated, turning back to the console. "Not non-existent." He tapped another key. The display shifted, revealing archived internal memos, cost reduction proposals flagged with low-risk annotations. Rowena recognized the document headers instantly. They'd been signed during a quarterly performance surge. Elliot stepped backward slightly as whispers spread among investors. "This isn't criminal," he insisted. "It's strategic scaling." "It's negligence," Marissa said flatly. Caleb's gaze remained steady on the data, and negligence becomes vulnerability. The room felt different now. Minutes earlier, it had been a stage for humiliation. Now it was a tribunal of exposure. Rowena straightened, authority recalibrated not through dominance, but through acknowledgement. "Mr. Kessler," she said firmly, pending immediate internal review, "your system access is suspended." Shock rippled through the room. Security moved, not toward Caleb this time, but toward Elliot. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Elliot sputtered, "You can't do this in front of investors. We already are," Rowena replied coldly. The screens still glowed with the trace path. Evidence. Transparent. Unavoidable. Caleb stepped back from the console slowly. The system diagnostics shifted from red to stable green across the upper display. The sandboxed exploit remained contained. For the first time since the 10-second ultimatum, the building's hum sounded steady again. Rowena turned to face the room. "Today," she said, voice carrying across marble and glass, "we witnessed the value of institutional memory. Her eyes moved briefly to the man in the maintenance uniform. And the cost of ignoring it, investors nodded. Murmurs softened into cautious relief. Public exposure had done more than contain a breach. It had recalibrated power. Caleb picked up his tool bag quietly. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood there as executives, board members, and investors looked at him, not as the man who'd been given 10 seconds to leave, but as the architect who had just saved their foundation. The executive floor didn't erupt into applause. It wasn't that kind of room. Power rarely clapped. It recalculated. Security escorted Elliot toward the elevators, his protests fading into the polished distance. The mirrored credential trace still hovered on the main display, glowing like a quiet indictment above the boardroom table. Caleb remained where he stood, one hand resting lightly on his tool bag. The air felt different now, less frantic, more aware. Rowena turned slowly to face the investors clustered near the glass walls. The skyline behind them shimmered in afternoon light, indifferent to the corporate tremor that had nearly fractured the building. "You deserve clarity," she said, voice steady and amplified. "An internal vulnerability was exposed today. It has been contained." Marissa stepped forward, tablet in hand. "All investor portals are fully restored. No accounts were compromised. We will conduct an independent audit to ensure structural resilience." Murmurs softened into measured nods. But eyes kept drifting back to him. The maintenance uniform, the worn gloves, the calm expression that hadn't shifted once. Rowena finally looked at him directly, not as an obstacle or inconvenience, but as a factor she had misjudged. "You built the original architecture," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Why were you working maintenance in this building?" A fair question. He didn't bristle, didn't rush. "My daughter was diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune condition 8 years ago," he said evenly. "Treatment schedules didn't align with executive travel. I stepped down." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any dramatic explanation. An investor near the front lowered his champagne glass slowly. Marissa's expression softened for the first time that afternoon. "You never returned." "I was asked to consult once," he said. "I declined. Stability mattered more than status." The words lingered in the marble and glass. Rowena absorbed them carefully. She had built her reputation on aggressive expansion, relentless forward motion. Personal sacrifice for family wasn't a language she'd ever publicly prioritized. "And maintenance?" she pressed. "I needed proximity," he replied. "Not prestige." A faint murmur rippled through the room again. Proximity. He had remained inside the building, not in the boardroom, but close enough to the infrastructure to hear its pulse. Rowena stepped closer to him, lowering her voice though the microphone still carried it. "You let me threaten to have you removed. You were protecting your event," he said calmly. "You didn't have the full picture. And now I do?" He held her gaze without challenge. "Now you have part of it." The tension between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was recalibrating, like two chess players recognizing each other's moves mid-game. Marissa cleared her throat. "Rowena, investors are requesting a brief statement acknowledging Mr. Ward's role in containment. Public acknowledgement, not private gratitude, not a quiet bonus, visible recognition." Rowena hesitated for only a breath. Then she turned back toward the room. "Virelli Dynamics was founded on architectural precision," she said. "Today, we were reminded that its original architect remains unmatched in understanding its core." She stepped aside slightly, opening physical space beside her. Caleb Ward prevented what could have escalated into significant reputational damage. The words were measured, controlled, but undeniable. A few investors began clapping lightly. Others followed, not exuberant, but respectful. The sound echoed strangely in the high-ceilinged space. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the tension. Public exposure had achieved its purpose. The humiliation that had unfolded minutes earlier, 10 seconds to leave, had been inverted. Now he stood in the center of the same executive floor, acknowledged before the same witnesses. Rowena looked at him again, this time without calculation. "You said this was reconnaissance," she said quietly. "That someone was mapping response times." "Yes." "And now they know you intervened." "They do." Marissa's expression tightened. "Which means if this was strategic positioning, we haven't seen the final move." The building's hum felt steadier but not peaceful. Caleb glanced toward the massive windows, where the skyline shimmered against gathering clouds. "This wasn't about stealing money," he said. "It was about testing leadership." Rowena folded her arms, but the gesture no longer signaled dominance. It signaled thought. "You believe there's more coming." "I believe whoever initiated this didn't expect public exposure," he replied. "That changes their calculus." Silence settled again, not fearful, but anticipatory. An investor stepped forward. "Miss Varelli, will Mr. Ward be formally reinstated to oversee this audit?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rowena didn't answer immediately. She studied him, the steady posture, the absence of ego, the quiet certainty that it held when everything flickered. "You said stability mattered more than status," she said. "It still does, and if stability now requires you upstairs instead of in the service corridors?" He considered that not for pride, but for consequence. Upstairs meant longer hours, higher visibility, greater pressure. Downstairs meant predictability, proximity to his daughter's schedule. "I'd consider it," he said finally. "On one condition," Rowena arched her brows slightly. "Which is?" "Security protocols are rebuilt from foundation up," he said. "No cost-cutting at the expense of structural integrity." A faint smile ghosted across her expression, small but real. "You negotiate boldly for someone who was nearly escorted out." He didn't smile back. "I negotiate because the foundation deserves it." The investors watched carefully. This wasn't just a technical recovery anymore. It was a cultural shift unfolding in real time. Rowena extended her hand, not to dismiss, not to command, to acknowledge. "Then let's rebuild it properly," she said. He looked at her hand for half a second. Then he shook it. The same executive floor that had echoed with humiliation now bore witness to something else entirely. Respect earned not through title, but through truth made visible. Their handshake lingered for half a breath, longer than protocol required. Then the executive floor shifted again, from spectacle to strategy. Rowena withdrew her hand first, turning toward the massive display screen still glowing with system diagnostics. "If this was reconnaissance," she said, voice steady but quieter now, "then whoever initiated it will adjust." Caleb nodded once. "They already are." Marissa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Meaning?" He tapped the tablet still connected to the console. A faint secondary ping flickered in the lower corner, subtle, almost polite. "The mirrored credential wasn't the only anomaly," he said. "There's a dormant handshake attempt sitting in the outbound logs." Rowena's eyes sharpened. "Outbound? Yes." His jaw tightened slightly. "Something inside our network is preparing to communicate externally. It hasn't executed yet." A ripple of unease moved through the room. The investors who had begun to relax straightened again. "Can you isolate it?" Marissa asked. "I can," he replied. "But if I shut it down immediately, we lose visibility into where it's trying to connect." Rowena understood instantly. "So we let it run, briefly." The weight of that decision settled across marble and glass. Rowena turned to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are implementing enhanced monitoring protocols. There is no active threat to your assets. It wasn't a lie." But it wasn't the full picture either. Caleb adjusted the sandbox partition, creating a controlled observation tunnel, an invisible corridor that would allow the outbound handshake to initiate without escaping containment. The old diagnostic tablet hummed faintly in his hands. One of the IT engineers whispered, "That sandbox shouldn't be capable of live relay." "It wasn't," he replied calmly. "Until now, Marissa studied the screen. You're modifying it in real time?" "I designed it to be flexible," he said. Rowena watched him work, steady, precise, unhurried. No grand gestures, no ego, just competence. If you've ever seen someone underestimated until their skill rewrote the narrative, subscribe now, because moments like this prove quiet mastery always finds the light. The outbound handshake flickered to life. A digital pulse reached outward from the internal node, following a narrow, concealed pathway. Caleb traced it, eyes narrowing. "It's routing through a third-party analytics shell," he murmured. Masked as performance reporting, Marissa's expression hardened. "That's deliberate, yes." On the main display, a map projection appeared, lines of data arcing toward a server cluster overseas. The room reacted audibly this time. "That's not domestic infrastructure," one investor said sharply. Rowena's voice cut through the tension. "Stay calm," but her pulse had quickened. Caleb isolated the foreign node's handshake ID. Recognition flickered across his face, not surprise but confirmation. "What is it?" Marissa pressed. He exhaled slowly. "It's a shell corporation tied to the same vendor that optimized our infrastructure." Rowena's jaw set. "You're telling me the cost-saving partner we approved is linked to this reconnaissance?" "I'm telling you," he said evenly, "that someone sold your architectural blueprint." The words landed harder than any accusation earlier that day. Marissa's fingers tightened around her tablet. "If that's proven, it will be," Caleb interrupted softly. The outbound handshake attempted full transmission. He let it proceed for 1 controlled second. 2. Then he severed the connection cleanly. The projection lines vanished from the display. Silence followed. The building's hum felt steadier again, but beneath it, a new understanding settled. This wasn't internal sabotage alone. It was external exploitation facilitated by internal negligence. Rowena stepped closer to him again. "We confront the vendor immediately." "Not yet," he said. Her eyes flashed briefly. "Why not?" "Because now they know we're aware," he replied. "If we confront them prematurely, they'll destroy whatever evidence remains." Marissa nodded slowly. "He's right. We need a controlled response." Rowena's posture shifted, not defensive, but strategic. "You're suggesting we bait them. I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that we let them believe the reconnaissance succeeded. Feed them controlled architectural data, obsolete partitions. Watch who responds." The investors were no longer whispering. They were listening. Publicly. Openly. The humiliation that had begun this afternoon had transformed into something else entirely. Rowena folded her arms again, but this time not from dominance. From decision. "You'll oversee it," she said. Caleb hesitated only briefly. With full transparency, she nodded once. "Agreed." Marissa stepped forward. "We'll assemble a forensic oversight committee immediately." Caleb unplugged the diagnostic cable and slipped the tablet back into his tool bag. The executive floor looked different now, not a stage of imbalance, but a battlefield reclaimed. Rowena faced the investors again. "You witnessed a vulnerability today," she said. "You also witnessed the integrity of this company's foundation." Her gaze flickered toward him, and the expertise required to defend it. There was no applause this time, just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that lingers longer. As the crowd began dispersing into smaller strategic conversations, Caleb stood still for a moment, absorbing the shift. Minutes ago, he'd been given 10 seconds to leave. Now he was shaping the company's next move. Rowena stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he and Marissa could hear. "You said stability mattered more than status," she reminded him. "It does. And this level of responsibility?" He glanced toward the skyline, clouds thickening at the horizon. "It protects stability," he said simply. Rowena studied him, then nodded once more. "Then let's prepare," she said quietly. "Because if we're going to expose this properly..." Her gaze drifted briefly to the massive screen still glowing faintly above them. "We do it in a way no one can ignore." And for the first time that day, the power on the executive floor felt balanced, not by title, but by truth positioned exactly where everyone could see it. The investors gradually dispersed into controlled clusters of conversation, their earlier panic replaced by strategic recalibration. Assistants moved quickly, restoring presentation screens to neutral corporate visuals. The skyline beyond the glass darkened under gathering clouds, casting a muted gray over the executive floor. Caleb remained near the central console, eyes still on residual data scrolling across a smaller side monitor. The outbound handshake attempt had stopped, but not disappeared. Digital footprints never truly vanished. They lingered in patterns, in timestamps, in microscopic irregularities most people never thought to question. Rowena approached him again, heels quieter now against the marble. "If we're going to bait them," she said, voice slow and precise, "we need to control the narrative upstairs and the trap downstairs." He nodded. "The sandbox partition can simulate architectural updates. We'll feed the vendor obsolete encryption layers, make it look like we're restructuring core authentication." Marissa joined them, tablet tucked under her arm. "And when they attempt to access it?" "We trace the receiving endpoint in real time," he replied. "Not just the shell corporation, the actual operator behind it." Rowena folded her arms thoughtfully. "You're confident they'll take the bait?" "They already tested response time," he said. "They'll want confirmation that the vulnerability still exists." A faint rumble of thunder rolled outside, distant but steady. The executive floor felt like a command center now. Controlled. Watchful. Marissa glanced toward the boardroom doors. "The audit committee will convene within the hour. We can't appear fractured." Rowena's expression hardened, not with arrogance, but resolve. "We won't." She turned to Caleb fully. "You'll operate from the executive security suite." He looked down briefly at his maintenance uniform, dust still clinging faintly to the fabric. "Upstairs," she clarified. "With access." He considered it for a moment, not as validation, but as logistics. "My daughter's pickup is at 5, he said calmly. Rowena blinked once, thrown slightly by the grounded reality of that statement. "We'll have containment protocols automated by then," he continued. "I won't compromise that." Maurice's expression softened faintly. "We can structure oversight in shifts." Rowena studied him again. "You're negotiating stability even now. I always do." The thunder outside rolled louder this time, closer. One of the engineers approached cautiously. "We've mirrored the obsolete encryption files into the sandbox. It's ready for simulated deployment." Caleb stepped back toward the console. "Initiate phased upload." The large display screens flickered once more, this time intentionally. A fabricated architectural update appeared in the system logs, visible enough to be tempting, hidden enough to look authentic. Marissa watched carefully. "How long before they respond?" "Minutes," he said. The building's hum deepened slightly as servers processed the simulated deployment. Rowena moved toward the glass wall, staring out at the city below. They thought they could map us quietly, she said. They underestimated what institutional memory looks like. He didn't respond. He was watching the outbound log monitor. A faint digital pulse appeared again. There. Handshake attempt, he said quietly. The screen displayed an outbound ping toward the same overseas server cluster. But this time, they were ready. Don't cut it, Rowena instructed. I won't. The handshake connected. Data packets flowed, carefully curated, harmless architectural fragments designed to look valuable. Marissa leaned closer. Trace it. Caleb initiated the real-time trace protocol he'd embedded years ago but never imagined using this way. The map projection expanded across the main screen, lines of data extending outward like luminous veins. The overseas shell node lit up. Then another server behind it. And another. Layer by layer, the trace peeled back anonymization protocols. The room grew silent again, not with fear but anticipation. Routing through a private investment firm, one engineer whispered. Marissa's eyes widened slightly. That's not just a vendor. The final endpoint resolved. A name appeared on the display. Not Elliot, not an internal executive, but a competing technology conglomerate that had publicly attempted to acquire Virali Dynamics twice in the past 5 years. Rowena's posture straightened instantly. They couldn't buy us, she said quietly. So they tried to weaken you, Caleb finished. The investors who remained on the floor stepped closer, reading the glowing name on the massive screen. Recognition spread quickly. Public exposure. Complete. Marissa exhaled slowly. This is industrial espionage, yes, Caleb said. And now, Rowena added, eyes never leaving the display, we have proof. Thunder cracked sharply outside, closer now, echoing faintly through reinforced glass. The handshake remained active, still believing it was siphoning valuable architecture. Caleb isolated the trace logs and duplicated them across secure internal storage. They'll realize soon that what they received is useless, he said. When they do, they'll know we saw them. Rowena turned from the window back to the room, and by then, she said evenly, legal action will already be in motion. The investors weren't murmuring now. They were nodding, not at her, at the screen, at the evidence, at the man who had insisted this be handled where everyone could see it. Minutes ago, he'd been given 10 seconds to leave. Now he had delivered something far more powerful than containment. He had delivered clarity, and as the storm outside finally broke against the glass, rain streaking down the skyline, the executive floor stood not as a place of fragile optics, but as a fortress rebuilt in full view of those who mattered most. Rain lashed against the glass walls in diagonal sheets, the storm finally arriving in full force. Lightning flashed across the skyline, illuminating the executive floor in sharp white pulses that made the massive display screens glow even brighter. The name of the competing conglomerate still hovered across the central projection. No speculation. No rumor. Proof. Rowena stood at the head of the boardroom table now, posture straight, hands resting lightly on the polished surface. Investors remained on the floor, no longer drifting away. Phones were out, but not recording panic. Recording accountability. Marissa stepped beside the display. The trace logs are duplicated and time-stamped. Legal can file preliminary injunctions within the hour. Caleb remained near the console, scanning the outbound handshake as it continued siphoning carefully curated, obsolete data. He allowed it to run just long enough to solidify evidence, then terminated the connection cleanly. The map projection vanished. Silence followed. Not fragile. Resolved. Rowena looked toward him. Is there any residual vulnerability? He shook his head once. The sandbox partition remains sealed. Root authentication has been rebuilt with layered biometric confirmation. There's no open node left to exploit. The IT engineers exchanged stunned glances. You rebuilt root in under an hour, one said quietly. I restored it, he corrected. Marissa exhaled, tension finally draining from her shoulders. Then this ends here. Caleb didn't answer. Because he knew it didn't. Exposure never ends quietly. It echoes. Rowena turned to the room fully, rain streaking the skyline behind her like moving steel. What you witnessed today was not weakness, she said, voice steady and amplified. It was transparency. Her eyes swept across the investors, then paused briefly on the man in the maintenance uniform. We were tested. We responded. And we will pursue legal recourse against those who attempted to undermine this company's foundation. A low murmur of approval followed. An older investor near the front stepped forward. Miss Varelli, if not for Mr. Ward, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rowena inclined her head slightly. If not for institutional memory, she said carefully, we would be having a very different conversation. Then she did something no one in that room expected. She stepped aside again, physically, visibly, opening the center space. Mr. Ward, she said, voice carrying clearly, would you care to address the floor? A few hours ago, that same floor had nearly witnessed his removal. Now it waited. Caleb looked at the investors, then at the screens, then briefly at the storm outside. He didn't move immediately. He wasn't a man driven by spotlight. But he understood leverage. He stepped forward. The marble felt solid beneath his boots. I don't have a speech prepared, he said calmly, but I'll say this. The room quieted completely. Systems don't fail because they're attacked. They fail because someone decides protection is optional. The words settled slowly. We weren't targeted because we were weak. We were targeted because someone believed we'd prioritize optics over structure. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. He continued, voice steady, not accusatory. Today proved that's not the case, but prevention costs less than recovery. Marissa watched him closely. Rowena did too. If we rebuild this foundation properly, he finished, no competitor will need to test us again. He stepped back. No applause erupted. But something deeper replaced it. Trust. Rowena nodded once. Effective immediately, she announced, Varelli Dynamics will undergo a full structural cybersecurity overhaul led by Mr. Ward. The words were clear, public, permanent. The investors reacted not with shock, but with relief. An official pivot had been made. One of them asked, will he be returning as chief security architect? Rowena didn't hesitate this time. If he accepts, all eyes shifted back to him. Rain hammered harder against the glass. He considered the skyline for a brief second. Then he answered carefully. I'll oversee the rebuild, he said, but I won't sacrifice what matters most. Rowena held his gaze. Which is? My daughter, he replied simply. A faint, almost imperceptible shift moved through the room, something human breaking through corporate steel. Marissa nodded once. Flexible oversight can be arranged. Rowena extended her hand again, not ceremonially but decisively. This time she said quietly, no ultimatums. He shook her hand. The lightning outside flashed again, illuminating the skyline behind them. The executive floor no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a recalibrated structure. Security had escorted Elliot away. Legal teams were already mobilizing. The competing conglomerate would wake up to a lawsuit supported by unassailable trace logs, and investors would leave that building not with doubt, but with certainty. Caleb picked up his tool bag once more. Same uniform, same boots, different gravity. As he walked toward the elevators, no one stopped him. No one questioned his presence. The storm outside began to ease slightly. rain softening against glass. Rowena watched him go, not with suspicion, not with superiority, but with recognition. Minutes earlier, she had given him 10 seconds to leave. Now she had given him the keys to rebuild the foundation. And in the quiet after thunder, the skyscraper stood steadier than it had that morning, because power had shifted from appearance to architecture. The elevator doors closed softly behind him, muting the executive floor's low murmur of recalibrated power. For the first time in hours, the hum of the building sounded almost ordinary again, like a machine that had survived its stress test. He didn't press the lobby button. Instead, he paused between floors, keycard hovering over the control panel. A private access tone chimed. The doors reopened, not to marble and glass, but to the executive security suite Rowena had mentioned earlier. She was already inside. So was Marissa. No investors, no engineers, no witnesses, just the quiet after exposure. Rowena stood near a long steel table lined with active monitors displaying stabilized diagnostics. She didn't turn immediately when he stepped in. "I wanted to see whether you'd leave," she said finally. "I told you I'd oversee the rebuild," he replied calmly. "That wasn't what I meant." He understood. She faced him fully now. No microphone. No amplified authority, just a woman recalculating leadership after public correction. "I built this company on momentum," she said. "Speed, expansion, aggressive positioning. I believed structural resilience was implied. It isn't," he said quietly. Marissa leaned against the table, arms crossed loosely. "Investors trust growth," she said. "They rarely see what sustains it, until it breaks," he added. Rowena studied him again, not measuring threat, but value. "When I gave you 10 seconds, she said, voice lower, "I assumed control meant elimination of uncertainty. And now? Now I know control means recognizing who understands the uncertainty better than you." Silence settled. Not heavy, but honest. The storm outside had thinned to steady rain. On the monitors, system diagnostics glowed stable green across every partition. Marissa tapped her tablet once. Legal has already initiated filings against the conglomerate. With the trace logs public, they'll settle rather than risk discovery. Rowena nodded. "And the vendor?" "Under investigation," Marissa replied. "Preliminary findings show undisclosed subcontracting." Rowena exhaled slowly, the cost-saving measure, the buried risk, the arrogance of assuming resilience without verifying it. She looked at him directly. "You warned us once." "Yes, and we minimized it. You prioritized margins," he said evenly. "And you prioritized architecture. I prioritized longevity." A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "You're difficult to intimidate." "I wasn't trying to intimidate you." "No," she admitted, "you weren't." She stepped closer, not imposing, not commanding. "I misjudged you," she said plainly. The words carried weight. CEOs didn't often speak that sentence aloud. He didn't react dramatically. "I misjudged you too," he said. Her brow lifted slightly. "I assumed you wouldn't allow public exposure," he clarified. "You did?" Rowena considered that. It was the only move left once the truth surfaced. "And you chose it." Another silence. Marissa broke it gently. "The board will formalize your oversight role tomorrow morning," he nodded once. "Remote access will be sufficient for most functions." Rowena's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. "You truly won't return full-time?" "My daughter's treatment schedule hasn't changed," he said. "Neither have my priorities." Something softened in her expression, not weakness, but perspective. "When you stepped down," she asked, "did you ever resent the company?" "No. Why not?" "Because companies aren't villains," he replied. "People's decisions are." The words lingered. Rowena turned slightly toward the window, rain streaking down the glass in faint silver lines. "I built Pirelli Dynamics to win," she said. Today reminded me winning and protecting aren't the same thing. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Marissa straightened. "We should prepare for tomorrow's press briefing." Rowena nodded, but her eyes stayed on him. "One more thing," she said quietly. He waited. "You could have walked away when I humiliated you, yes. You didn't." He met her gaze evenly, because the building was about to fall. A small, almost reluctant smile crossed her face, and because you designed it, that too. The security suite lights dimmed slightly as the system shifted into evening energy mode. Outside, the storm finally began to break apart, clouds thinning over the city. Rowena extended her hand once more, not for spectacle, not for witnesses. "For what it's worth," she said, "I won't give you 10 seconds again." He shook her hand briefly. "For what it's worth," he replied, "I won't need them." Marissa let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like relief. The balance in the room felt settled, not hierarchical, not fragile. Aligned. He picked up his tool bag once more. Same uniform, same worn gloves, but now the weight of the day felt different. Not heavy, resolved. As he stepped back into the elevator and pressed the lobby button this time, the doors slid closed with a soft mechanical sigh. Rowena remained standing in the security suite, watching the stabilized system metrics glow across the monitors. The foundation had been tested. It hadn't cracked. And the man she had nearly removed in 10 seconds had proven something no quarterly report ever could. That architecture, once ignored, demands to be remembered. The elevator descended smoothly this time. No tremors, no alarms, no flashing warnings. Just a steady mechanical rhythm of a building at rest. When the lobby doors opened, the atmosphere felt almost surreal. Employees moved through the polished space unaware of how close the company had come to fracture. The security desk no longer looked at him with suspicion. No one stopped him. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist. The skyline glowed under clearing clouds, city lights beginning to flicker alive in the early evening. He stepped onto the sidewalk, inhaling air that no longer carried tension. His phone buzzed. A message from Lena. "Did you finish work early today?" A faint smile touched his face. On my way, he typed back. Traffic moved steadily as he crossed toward the parking structure. The events of the afternoon replayed in fragments. The 10-second ultimatum, the frozen screens, the exposed trace, the silent shift in power. None of it felt triumphant. It felt necessary. By the time he reached the school pickup line, the storm had completely passed. Children spilled out of the building in waves of laughter and backpacks, noise, movement, life untouched by corporate warfare. Lena spotted him immediately. She ran the last few steps, ponytail bouncing. "You're early." "Wrapped up something important," he said. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "You look different, do I?" Not mad, she clarified, just steady. He knelt slightly to meet her eyes. Sometimes steady is enough. They walked toward the car together, her small hand slipping into his. "You know that building you work in?" she asked as they drove. "The tall one with the shiny windows?" "I know it. Did something happen there?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Perceptive. Always had been. It almost forgot how strong its foundation was, he said carefully. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Did you fix it?" I reminded it. That seemed to satisfy her. At a red light, his phone buzzed again. An email notification. Subject line, official appointment, Chief Security Architect Deckful. He didn't open it immediately. Lena leaned forward slightly from the back seat. "Are we still having pasta tonight?" "Of course." "Good," she said, settling back. "Because important stuff shouldn't ruin pasta." A quiet laugh escaped him. No, he agreed, it shouldn't. Back at their apartment, the evening unfolded with comforting normalcy. The scent of garlic and tomato sauce filled the kitchen. The television murmured softly in the background. Homework spread across the table. His phone buzzed twice more, news alerts this time. Pirelli Dynamics exposes industrial espionage attempt. CEO announces structural overhaul after internal vulnerability. He finally opened the appointment email. It was formal, precise, public. Recognition embedded in corporate language. He closed it after a moment. Lena looked up from her homework. "You okay?" He nodded. "Yeah. Did you win?" He considered the question carefully. This wasn't about winning, he said. It was about making sure something built to last actually lasts. She smiled faintly. That's kind of the same thing. Maybe she was right. Later that night, after dishes were washed and homework checked, he stood by the apartment window. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, the skyscraper visible among dozens of lights. Earlier that day, he'd been given 10 seconds to leave that place. 10 seconds to disappear. Instead, he'd stayed, not for pride, not for revenge, but because the foundation mattered. His phone buzzed one last time, a short message from Rowena. "Press briefing complete. Investors are steady. Thank you." He stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Rebuild it right." He set the phone down. Behind him, Lena's quiet breathing drifted from her bedroom. Stability, that was the only metric that ever mattered. Power shifts. Titles change. Companies expand and contract. But architecture, real architecture, remains. He turned off the lights and let the city glow through the window. If you want the next story where quiet strength rewrites the rules of power, tell me the title you have in mind. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad was banned from the hospital until the head surgeon heard his name. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?